Driving a taxi in Los Angeles at night had its perks. The city was quieter, the traffic lighter, and the tips often better. But it also had its downsides, the odd characters, the drunks, and the occasional sense of unease that crept in from the shadows. Still, it was a job and I was good at it. It was a little past midnight and I had just dropped off a fare in West Hollywood. The streets were slick with recent rain, and the air had that fresh, clean scent that only comes after a downpour. I was thinking of calling it a night when the dispatch crackled to life. Cab 47, we got a pickup request at the corner of Melrose and Fairfax. You available? I picked up the receiver. Roger that. I'm on my way. It took me less than 10 minutes to reach the intersection. The street was deserted, except for a single figure standing under a flickering streetlight. A woman, dressed in a long dark coat, her hair cascading down her shoulders in wet, tangled strands. She looked up as I pulled over, her face pale and drawn. Need a ride? I asked, rolling down the passenger window. Yes, please, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She opened the door and slipped into the back seat, her eyes never meeting mine. Where to? I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Downtown, she said, her voice soft but firm. Just drive. I'll tell you where to turn. I nodded and pulled away from the curb. The city lights blurred past as I headed towards downtown, the silence in the cab growing heavier with each passing mile. I tried to make small talk, but she wasn't interested. Her gaze was fixed out the window, her expression unreadable. After a while, she spoke. Take a left at the next light. I followed her instructions, the streets becoming narrower and less familiar. We were moving away from the heart of downtown into an area I rarely visited. The buildings were older, the streetlights dimmer. A sense of unease began to creep in. Are you sure this is the right way? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, she replied. Just keep going. We continued in silence, the city around us becoming increasingly alien. The rain started again, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a heavy downpour. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and I could barely see the road ahead. Turn right here, she said, suddenly, her voice sharp. I turned, the cab's tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. We were now on a narrow, deserted street, flanked by tall, decaying buildings. The sense of unease grew stronger, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Are you sure this is the right way? I asked again, my voice betraying my nerves. Yes, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Just a bit further. We drove on, the rain pounding on the roof, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I stole another glance at her in the rearview mirror. She was staring straight ahead, her expression blank. Stop here, she said abruptly. I pulled over, the cab idling in front of a dilapidated building. The windows were boarded up, and the paint was peeling off in large patches. It looked abandoned, a relic of a forgotten past. Are you sure this is the place? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Yes, she said, opening the door. Wait for me, I'll be back soon. Before I could protest, she stepped out into the rain and disappeared into the building. I sat there, the engine running, my mind racing. Something about this felt wrong, very wrong. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 1:27 a.m. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. I debated leaving, but something kept me there, a sense of obligation perhaps, or simple curiosity. The rain continued to pour, the street around me empty and silent. Suddenly the passenger door opened, and the woman climbed back in. She was soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and frantic. Drive, she said urgently. Now. I didn't need to be told twice. I floored the gas pedal, the cab lurching forward, tires screeching on the wet pavement. We sped down the narrow street, the sense of dread growing stronger with each passing moment. What's going on? I asked, my voice barely steady. Just keep driving, she said, her eyes darting around nervously. Don't stop. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear. I wanted to ask more, but something told me it was better not to know. We drove in silence, the rain hammering on the roof, the city a blur outside. Suddenly she screamed. A high, piercing sound that sent chills down my spine. I looked back just in time to see a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, rushing towards the cab. I swerved, barely avoiding it, and sped up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who was that?" I shouted, my mind racing. "Just keep driving," she screamed, her voice filled with terror. I didn't need to be told again. I drove as fast as I could, the cab skidding around corners, the rain blinding me. The shadowy figure seemed to be everywhere, appearing in my peripheral vision, only to vanish when I looked directly at it. Finally, we burst out onto a main road, the streetlights glaringly bright after the darkness of the side streets. I slowed down, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are you okay?" I asked, glancing back at her. She was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "Just keep going," she whispered. We drove in silence for a while, the city slowly returning to normal around us. The rain began to let up, and the streets became more familiar. I started to relax, thinking the worst was over. But then she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to tell you something." I glanced at her in the mirror, my unease returning. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "I'm not supposed to be here." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I died," she said, her voice trembling. "A year ago. In a car accident, right on that street where you picked me up." I felt a chill run down my spine, my mind struggling to process her words. "That's impossible," I said, my voice barely audible. "You're here, you're alive." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I was killed instantly, but I can't move on. I'm trapped here, reliving that night over and over." I stared at her, my mind reeling. It couldn't be true. It didn't make sense. But as I looked into her eyes, I knew she was telling the truth. "Why did you come to me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Because you can help me," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "You can help me move on." "How?" I asked, my mind racing. "Take me back to the place where I died," she said. "Help me find peace." I hesitated, fear and disbelief battling within me, but something in her eyes compelled me to help. I nodded, turning the cab around and heading back towards the narrow, deserted street. We drove in silence, the rain beginning to fall again. As we approached the place where I had picked her up, the sense of dread returned. I pulled over, the cab idling in front of the dilapidated building. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where it happened." I nodded, my heart pounding. "What do we do now?" "Just wait," she said, her eyes fixed on the building. "It will come." I didn't know what she meant, but I did as she asked. We sat in silence, the rain pouring down, the street around us dark and empty. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, the same shadowy figure I had seen before. It moved towards the cab, its form shifting and changing. I felt a chill run down my spine as it approached. "That's it," she said, her voice trembling. "That's what killed me." I stared at the figure, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It reached the cab, its form becoming clearer. It was a man, his face twisted in anger and pain. "Why are you here?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its hand passing through the window, and touched the woman's shoulder. She gasped, her eyes widening in fear and pain. "No," I shouted, reaching out to stop it, but my hand passed through the figure, as if it were made of smoke. The woman screamed, her body convulsing. I watched in horror as her form began to fade, becoming translucent. The figure seemed to grow stronger, its form solidifying. "Help me," she screamed, her voice filled with terror. I didn't know what to do. I reached out again, but my hand passed through both of them. The figure's eyes met mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. "She belongs to me," it said, its voice a low growl.